This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you. I waited because I wanted to go on record thanking Fabrice and the Seminaire for having me over. It's a real pleasure and it's a little bit of an honor as well, I have to mention. So as Fabrice said, my book is a political and social history of the French anarchists' exile years in London between the late 1880s and early 1890s, tracing their legacy until the First World War and placing them in a broader context of exilic and transnational militancy. During the 1860s and early 1870s, anarchism emerged as an active political movement within the International Working Men's Association, the First International, especially among the Swiss section of the organization in the Jura. From then, from Switzerland, it went on to spread across Europe and far beyond. Like Italy or Belgium, from the late 1870s onwards, France harbored a large and active anarchist movement. And of course, we're speaking relatively here because anarchism was always a minority, a radical pursuit. But France was one of these countries where the anarchist movement prospered for quite a few years. Great Britain, which is frequently but not accurately regarded as a very inhospitable environment for anarchist ideas, also counted a fair number of anarchist groupings. Between 1880 and 1940, the French anarchists formed and maintained close connections with their British counterparts through a variety of channels. The French and British movements were in close contact from the early 1880s onwards. The International Revolutionary Socialist Congress, held in London in July 1881, helped foster personal ties among militants from both countries and also from far beyond as well. There were people who came from the United States on this occasion, not exclusively anarchists at the time because the lines were quite blurred, but also from a variety of revolutionary allegiances. During the 1880s, little groups of exiled French compagnons, and this was the nickname by which the anarchists referred to themselves, were formed in London. These French-speaking anarchist circles in London became larger and far more active and influential in the first half of the 1890s, when the theory of propaganda by the deed gained ground among anarchists. This concept of propaganda by the deed developed from 1876-77 among the anarchists of the First International, justified acts of violence as a way of publicizing anarchism and initiating the revolution. The main consequence of this propagation of propaganda by the deed was a series of anarchist-inspired terrorist attacks which swept over the Western world throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. You may know a few casualties. For instance, President McKinley in the United States was killed by an anarchist, famously Elizabeth of Austria, and in France, President Sadi Carnot was killed as well by an anarchist. This wave peaked in France between 1892 and 1894. The authorities of the French Republic retaliated with fierce repression, resulting in the arrest or silencing of most compagnons. Hundreds of them, however, at that stage chose exile, as before them had done the defeated supporters of the Second Republic in 1851 when Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte did his coup, and the communards after the insurrection had been crushed in 1871. Britain, the only country in Europe whose asylum policy remained fairly liberal in those years, became the destination of many active anarchists. Always relatively speaking, of course. About 500 French-speaking individuals settled there in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The French were not the only nationality who came to London. I'll come to this later. In London, a safe, if rather unpopular refuge, French-speaking and British militants came into direct contact and formed closer links with anarchists of other nationalities, similarly exiled. Despite their relatively small size, the London anarchist groups and the terrorist peril which they seemed to embody captured the public imagination in France, Britain, and many other countries. This moral panic was largely fed by the rise of the popular and tabloid press internationally. And this is my first slide. So the rise of the popular press. I've got two extracts here. This one is from Le Petit Journal. So quite typical, it's an illustration of, as it says, in Bombe au Café Terminus, one of the main terrorist attacks in 1893. And I think it's beautifully representative of mainstream representation of anarchists at the time. It's reassuring in a way. So you see the terrorist Meunier being caught and arrested by the police. And I think here there is a clear, I can't point here, but you have the clear emphasis on the strengths of the authorities who are about to neutralize the threatening anarchists. So it's a message of threat and saying that order still prevails. And it's expressed quite clearly, whereas here, although, sorry, there is obviously still an emphasis on violence and horror, especially in the expression of those beholding the scene. This side, it's from the British press, the the Illustrated London News. This appeared following an attack in February 1894, perpetrated by a Frenchman called Martial Bourdin, whom I will mention later. And I think here it's another stereotypical depiction of anarchism. The emphasis is on grimness. It's really grim. I think in a Victorian perspective, there's clearly a subtext of poverty and seediness as well being conveyed through the room dilapidated. This was Bourdin's lodgings, or perhaps his workshop. This is Charlotte Street in London, which was the main haunt of the anarchists. And this is the Greenwich Observatory, which Bourdin possibly attempted to attack with a bomb. But what happened is that the bomb exploded when Bourdin was carrying it. It's accidental detonation. We do not know that the bomb was meant for the Greenwich Observatory. But still, this is perhaps a more British representation of this anarchist peril. This moral panic was echoed in Parliament by the Conservative Party. This prompted a significant development of political surveillance and eventually contributed to the redefinition of asylum and immigration policies with the passage of the 1905 Aliens Act, which put an end to about 80 years of open-door immigration policy, a rather spectacular outcome considering the actual size and activities of these anarchist groupings. Most of the French companions ended their forestay in Britain in February 1895, when an amnesty allowed them back into France. At that stage, the direct daily contact afforded by exile was replaced with long-distance, largely network-based exchanges between the press, through the press and private correspondence, as well as occasional encounters between influential militants. All these interactions had a significant impact on the course of the French and international labour movements, one major outcome being the emphasis on promoting trade union infiltration by anarchists. After 1804, following 2 years of debate and discussion in anarchist circles about the quandaries of organisation between French, British and Italian militants led by Enrico Malatesta, the example of British trade unions became a central reference in the French anarchists' pro-union propaganda. This new strategic course was now the main goal of the French communist anarchists as they tried to steer away from the chaos left by the terrorist episode. This Franco-British connection proved essential in the elaboration and dissemination of the body of ideas, which was increasingly referred to as syndicalism in Britain, a term which was the English translation of the French term syndicalisme révolutionnaire. And the media commentators probably really like to emphasize that syndicalism had been imported from the French term. This process of ideological cross-fertilization continued and traveled both ways across the Channel, but also the Atlantic until the First World War. And we have an interesting network of transfers happening at that time, and also traveling all the way to Australia via Tom Mann, whom I'll mention later. So having summarized the overall contents of the book, I'll now talk a bit about the historiographic context. Well, the book, which is distantly, well, not so distantly related to a PhD supervised by François Poirier, was primarily meant as an addition to the existing studies on political exiles, and especially those relating to French exiles in Britain. where research has focused quite a lot on the post-1848 and communal generations. I discovered when I started researching the topic that nobody had paid attention to the anarchists, and this is why I came to work on them. A key issue in adopting this long-term transgenerational perspective has been to identify a possible specificity characterizing the anarchist, whilst also taking into account the very repetitive and codified nature of exile politics and the fact that the anarchists were very conscious of being heirs to a long tradition of political exile. They were very conscious of walking in the footsteps of Jules Vallès and other communal refugees, for instance. I believe now that the specificity of this anarchist exiles is that it was very, very short-lived. And for this reason, all the nostalgia and terrible spleen that tends to go with exile was not present at all. It was quite, I wouldn't go as far as saying that it was a joyful experience, but it wasn't one of terrible nostalgia, not a romantic exile as in the mid-century, for instance. It was, of course, very important to take into account the reception of the refugees and the debate surrounding their presence in Britain, especially given their impact over asylum and immigration policies in Britain. In the specific perspective of Franco-British scholarship, thriving field of research, as our presence here attests, there remain very significant gaps in knowledge, in particular concerning grassroots and working class exchanges. Although Fabrice has started making some headway into filling this gap with a very comprehensive study on British workers who came to France before 1848, but there remains a real focus on elite travel and aristocratic migration, maybe bourgeois tourism, but this is gradually changing. I also believe that the study of exile group provides a very interesting comparative perspective between France and Britain, or if one prefers, histoire croisée is a successful way of looking into comparative perspective. And in this case, I think the main point I would like to make with this study is really that whereas one tends to contrast the revolutionary French on the one hand and the very conservative Brits on the other, and especially with respect to trade unionism, it is not so true. We can see that there were very significant ideological transfers between both movements, and there were significant influences that the revolutionary CGT was considerably influenced by practices borrowed from trade unions, which were reinterpreted in the French context, and the other way around. So a history of exchanges, which I think serves to mitigate that traditional dichotomy between both models. The field of anarchist and syndicalist studies provides another very dynamic research context. And here I have another illustration. So this is my book, and this is the second book in the same series, The Knights Errant of Anarchy, London and the Italian Anarchist Diaspora, 1880-1917. So, in other words, somebody has written a very, very similar book studying Italian anarchists in London in exactly the same period. And this is the second book. My book, very fortunately, was the first in a new series launched by LUP, and Studies in Labour History, and Pietro's book is the second book in that series. So I think it does say something about the research context that two very similar monographs were published within, I think, 3 months apart, really by the same publisher. It does testify to a fairly dynamic research context. The French anarchist exiles, both collectively and individually, along with their Italian, German, Spanish and Filipino counterparts, have been enjoying something of a vogue in the past decade or so. Some of you may be familiar with the book by Benedict Anderson, Under Three Flags, Les Bannières de la Révolte in French, which is really about Filipino anarchists and their worldwide travels. So this vogue for anarchist studies is the result of two trends. First, the good fortunes of the transnational perspective within academia and its striking relevance for the study of anarchist and syndicalist histories, where internationalism was a key driver and transnational mobility a daily reality. So it really, really works to adopt this transnational perspective. Secondly, in a less convincing vein, but that's in my view, there was a briefer and slightly more opportunistic period of interest in anarchist exile groups following the terrorist wave of the early millennium, so 9/11, the 7/7 bombings in England. There was this belief, really, that the anarchists could be construed as an early example of a sort of nihilistic brand of transnational terrorism. So examples of this interpretation appeared in the mass media after the major terrorist events of the early millennium, and also among academics in a rather heated debate which took place in the journal, in the American journal, Terrorism and Political Violence. So the debate started in 2008 with an article written by James Galvin, who's a professor at UCLA specialized in the history of the Middle East, which compared Al-Qaeda's terrorism and the 1890s wave of anarchist-inspired terrorism, and went on to present extremist jihadism as a form of Islamic anarchism. So a very broad comparison. So Galvin argued that anarchism and jihadi terrorism shared a preference for, I quote, action over ideology that both relied on a highly decentralized structure built upon semi-autonomous cells and represented an external, comprehensive threat to the system. In both cases, according to Galvin, the terrorists sought to defend a culture perceived to be under attack. There was a prompt reply by Leonard Binder, who is also a professor at UCLA, but in a different department, so I don't know about institutional dimensions of the debate. So Binder challenged this view, and in particular challenged this notion of using a Western definition of anarchism and terrorism to comprehend Islamic notions. Finally, Richard Bach Jensen, who is a specialist of the anarchist movement and its policing in the late 19th century, replied to the initial article. He conceded the existence of a number of similarities between both waves of terrorism, such as their worldwide scale and radical anti-system targets and ambitions, the emphasis on direct action and the use of suicide attacks. And that's quite a powerful argument. However, Jensen also rejected the conflation of anarchism and Islamic terrorism and pointed to areas of profound incompatibility between the two, starting with a very, very different views on religion, which of course was fiercely rejected by the anarchists. The causes and forms of political violence in both cases also differed, Jensen stressed. So this terrorist line of comparison and source of historical parallels is of course something which cannot be dismissed, and it's very important for the historians of all these London exile movements, because there were all these moral panics surrounding the anarchists, so it's impossible to ignore them. But an equally fruitful line of reflection, in my view, comes from looking at these transnational anarchist groups and networks as an early instance of what has been called by globalization scholars transnational advocacy groups or transnational social movements. So today, globalization scholars use all these terms to refer to groups which cover the entire political spectrum, not specifically the far left. It really spans the whole political spectrum, and it's really used to depict cross-border movements on the far left. This is probably movements like the Occupy movement or Adbusters, and lots of movements coalescing around the World Social Forum and the Alter Globalization movement. So there are a few parallels here. So, of course, this implies leaving aside the whole question of the state, which is quite problematic for anarchists and also for many of these movements. But I think that the parallels here would lie in the nature of the causes which anarchists stood for. For instance, labor standards, environmentalism, gender rights, and a number of lifestyle issues. I think here there is affiliation. Another important similarity comes from the nature of organization, which is very much network-based as opposed to formal and institutionalized, because this is something which anarchists reject. They tend to enter formal, flexible groups and networks, which are not formalized or institutionalized. And lastly, there is, of course, the whole question of technology and transport, making both movements products of waves of globalization, as may be able to see here. The subtitle of the book, Exile and Transnationalism in the First Globalization, this period of the pre-war decades has been called the first globalization because, among other things, this acceleration of connections, global connections, and the role of transport and technology in accelerating these connections. I think here again, we do have a parallel. I am not desperate to push forward parallels and the search for historical precedents. I do not believe this story needs a justification. What I would like to say is that if one is looking at these historical comparisons, I do believe it's more fruitful to look at this sort of autour globalization, or again, anti-hegemonic globalization, as it's sometimes called. I think it's at least as fruitful as the terrorist line. And I think it's quite interesting in highlighting a sort of humanist, progressive filiation, which is quite different from the revolutionary tradition, for instance, although they do overlap. Now, having presented the theoretical background of these discussions, I'll present an overview of the chapters of the book, a bit more in depth. So the first chapter charts the origins of the French and British anarchist movements, highlighting their significant ideological differences up to the early 1890s. A key factor in explaining the contrasted fortunes of anarchism on both sides of the Channel is, quite predictably, the influence of the French revolutionary tradition, of course, of which anarchism is a late incarnation. By contrast, despite their increasingly militant stance throughout the 1880s with the socialist revival and the Great Labour Unrest just before the war, British workers were not pervaded with the hostility to the state, which fed the anarchist political discourse and imagination. The influence of liberalism in Britain was another considerable obstacle to the development of anarchism, of a homegrown anarchist movement in Britain, since, as François Bédarida has pointed out, it made the anti-authoritarian message of anarchism largely irrelevant. And here I quote Bédarida, "L'esprit libéral a joué contre l'esprit libertaire." Quote. And I think that pretty much sums up all the arguments you can make to explain why there was no British anarchism. Nonetheless, these differences were bridged by the links formed between the two movements in the late 1870s and early 1880s, and reinforced in the 1890s at the peak of the exile period. A steady trickle of exiles crossed the Channel as anti-anarchist repression intensified in France. These newly arrived individuals joined groups which had lived on after the previous waves of exiles, and especially the communards. So you do have a brief overlap when the communard generation sees the newly arrived anarchists. And distinct French-speaking anarchist groups are in existence in London from 1884 onwards, and they have their own dedicated spy. So that's when you know they've made it as a political movement. That's when the Préfecture de Police decides to send a spy, especially for them. The period was also characterized by a rekindling of both immigrant and native militancy in Britain, and a fair degree of socialist and international ecumenism in London. This was a time where people spoke of socialism, very, very broadly speaking, of the left. I think that's what we'd call it today. So going all the way to the Fabian Society, there were very brief brushes between George Bernard Shaw and the anarchists. I think anarchist scholars probably tend to overstate this a little because it's seen as a sort of perhaps redeeming connection. But also we will see William Morris, we see News from Nowhere also documents his brief and not always successful interactions with the anarchists. H.M. Heinemann from the Social Democratic Federation. You do see the anarchists seeing all these people. Soho and Fitzrovia remain the center, the geographic center of these anarchist groups. And here I have a map. I do apologize for the rather poor quality. This is, I forgot to reference this. This is from a book recently published by Deborah Kelly and Martin Corney called The London French, Liberty, Equality, Opportunity, Comprehensive Studies of French Presence in Britain, really since the Huguenots all the way to today. I really recommend it. And they've kindly made a map for my chapter on the anarchists. So here you see Soho and Fitzrovia and the key streets. Charlotte Street, the absolute epicenter of the French colony. Of course, today it's the epicenter of the advertising world in London. So there has been there have been a few waves of gentrification since then. Windmill Street, Gooch Street, Fitzroy Square, very important center in the French groups, Whitfield Street. So I think anyone who's looked at earlier generations of exiles will recognize all these venues. Euston, a bit further east as well, Hyde Park for political demonstrations, of course, but really the epicenter is Soho. The second chapter focuses on the sociological description of the exile circles. So the main source, as Fabrice mentioned, is the database of exiles anarchists, which I made up using a great variety of sources. So first, 3 boxes held at the Préfecture de Police, formerly of Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, but nowadays in Pierrefitte. And these boxes contain the police spies, the informants' reports written by all these informants sent by French authorities to keep an eye on the London anarchists. So you do get to read the day-to-day reports depicting what goes on in the streets of this anarchist quarter. You also get countless references in other police and general surveillance files, so held at the National Archives, especially in Paris. There are very, very few existing sources, surveillance archives in Britain. There is a long saga which has been documented. They are said to have been destroyed during the Second World War. A few scholars and journalists challenge this, so see, it's quite tempting, I suppose, to have a great narrative of secrecy surrounding surveillance, but this is a topic for elsewhere. I have also read extensively anarchist periodicals in both French and English, and it's very interesting because you can focus on the paratextual elements and all the little correspondence the anarchists used these papers to enter in contact with one another. So in each journal, and especially the main ones like Le Père Pénard, which was the main French language anarchist periodical, you'll have a section called Petite Note et Correspondance. P à Londres essaie de joindre M à Paris, écrire A, G à Amiens. And I think they were able to communicate like that. And sometimes you would have extremely lengthy notes like this. So gradually, sometimes there were more than just initials, but you can really gradually reconstitute a full network and several networks, in fact. And there is also one book, the main account really of the exile year, written by Charles Malato in his delightful exilic memoir called Les Joyeusetés de l'Exil, The Delights of Exile, very humorous but also quite factual and a great insight into their day-to-day lives. Private correspondences held at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, at the Institut Français d'Histoire Sociale, diplomatic correspondence, which can be found for Britain at the National Archives in Kew, or in France at the Quai d'Orsay, so documenting really the view of the authorities in this case. So all these sources converge towards the conclusion that London was the epicenter of the French anarchist movement for a few months. At the height of the repression, it was the core of the French anarchist movement, and it was based in London. It also concurs with this figure of about 500 exiles during this period. Of course, it begs the question of how come this is not better known, and how did this period of exile sink into collective oblivion? I think there are a number of hypotheses and possibly a lack of transmission on the part of the exiles themselves, probably for safety reasons, but also possibly because exile is quite a traumatic experience and not necessarily that one that somebody would want to share with the next generations. So among these 500 French-speaking militants, 300 are barely known. I have now a name, sometimes a bit more information. I'm sure they do exist. I'm sure I've encountered them several times, but only 60 of these 300 militants are really well known. And I know exactly what they did, and I have not a day-by-day, but a month-by-month overview. I know what they did during their time in exiles. So this figure made London, as people used to say at the time, the capital of the international anarchist conspiracy. Now, in terms of demographic composition, this group is probably more complex than one might have expected. People probably assumed anarchists, they were just young men in their 20s, and very, very brash. Well, in fact, quite complex. Only 5% of the individuals named in official sources are women, but I'm fairly sure that the proportion was far, far greater, probably closer to 20%. First of all, many of the companions whose names I have in this list and of whom I know a few things appear to have been married or in a steady relationship. And Malato notes in his memoir that the exiles often came with their families. So clearly this feminine presence exceeded the 5% mark. It is very likely that women and children were present but ignored by the police in their day-to-day reporting. And it's not necessarily very shrewd on their part, because this made women ideal vehicles to carry propaganda and to smuggle, for instance, propagandist literature back into France or in another city. So women had this specific role. A bit more predictably, most of the exiles were skilled artisans, so tailors, shoemakers, of course the traditional revolutionary occupations. Notable subgroups, perhaps less predictably, include journalists and writers, and it also explains why in such a short period this time of exile was so productive from a militant perspective, because the intelligentsia of the movement was heavily present in London, also because there were those who had got into trouble in France. Robbers, crooks, procurers, many draft dodgers lent anarchist groupings a degree of colourfulness for the historian, but also an air of illegality which attracted police attention. But of course, in exile, pre-exile occupation became quite meaningless. Making a living was extremely difficult. Poverty was rife. Some anarchists, actually one person died during this time in exile, died on a bench in Hyde Park from sheer deprivation. Sharing accommodation was the norm, but especially among French-speaking companions and sometimes with Italians who very often spoke French. So geographic concentration, as I've shown, was very, very prevalent, but it also means that this was the French quarter and it was infiltrated by police spies and informants on every street corner. And the more respectable and the more serious anarchists tended to avoid this place. So Émile Pouget, the editor of the Père Pénard, lived in Islington. Charles Malato moved to Hampstead. Peter Kropotkin, French-speaking, of Russian origin, but very, very closely connected with the French movement, lived in Bromley. And Louise Michel herself, the most famous of all the exiles, lived in the French Quarter for a period of time and then moved to Dulwich. I suspect all these areas were considerably cheaper back in the days than they are now. So in terms of exile politics, many features are similar to those observed in the context of other exile groups. So the central role of print propaganda as a vehicle for transnational activism is a key point. It was a very, very productive colony in terms of publications. So they published no less than 5 periodicals during the early 1890s. L'International, La Tribune Libre, Le Rothschild, sarcastically titled, of course, Le Tocsin, and Le Père Pénard, série londonienne. So all of these were very, very short-lived and irregular. There were also several pamphlets, actually quite a few, and again, very episodic, short-lived publication, but hugely influential for some of them. Le Père Pénard, as I mentioned, was the main publication, well, one of the key publications of French anarchism. The fact that it was recreated in London made it really quite significant. In terms of circulation, the print ranged from 500 to 5,000. That was completely exceptional for some of these pamphlets. And these were usually paid for by collections and charity events hosted within anarchist circles. But it's likely that the readership was far bigger because, of course, they would be circulated in clubs from one militant to another. So the impact was huge. And there's a very clear international dissemination of all this literature. Again, in France, that was very common for everything to be sent to France when it could escape the very close attention of the police. But also much further away in the United States, Argentina, Brazil, very, very clearly documented networks of dissemination there. So a really significant impact. In terms of connections, who did the exiles spend their time with in London? Well, I think, as in previous generation, they tended to keep to themselves to a significant degree, but among the sort of elite, you would like, which is a very problematic term really to use in the context of the anarchists, but the journalists, the theorists, the key activists, they were far more internationalized, and I think internationalized to a very surprising degree, and I think that's a difference from previous generations. I think it's because, again, this was a time of very practical internationalism, not ideal. It was about organizing, about forming associations, about getting results to some extent. So you do have an exceptional degree, really, of international interactions in some circles. So some militants like Auguste Hamon from France, who later taught at the LSE, but that's different story, and who later became very connected with the Fabian Society. Peter Kropotkin from Russia, Enrico Malatesta from Italy, Charles Malato from both France and Italy, Louise Michel from France, Émile Pouget from France, the Rossetti family, the young Rossettis. There were two adolescents, the nephews of the painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, had a short-lived affair with anarchism, and they co-edited the paper The Torch, and they were really at the core, at the center of these anarchist circles for a few years. Rudolf Rocker from Germany, who is very closely connected with the Jewish anarchist movement in the East End of London. John Turner from Britain. So these were the names you would see at every international event, and they were very international, very cosmopolitan in their socialization. So here I have an example, actually two examples, 10 years apart. So the People's Martyr, anniversary meeting, the 11th of November 1890. The 11th of November was a commemoration for German-American anarchists who had been executed in Chicago. And you have the list. I'm sorry, it's not terribly easy to read, but you can see a few. You can see Louise Michel here, and here you can see William Morris. So also going back to that day when people used to socialize across different socialist groups. Now, a few years later, you have 1896 Trade Union Congress, and that's a fringe meeting. And here you have really the main, I think, the core speakers of all these events. So Malatesta, Ben Tillett, trade unionist, Tom Mann, trade unionist, later closely connected with the anarchist, Frank Hitz, Kropotkin, Louise Michel again. So I think it shows, and this was incredibly repetitive. We could have cited a strong number of similar events. Right. So really, we're looking at what is, in my view, a golden age of internationalism. This is not to say that everybody partook very joyfully in these international exchanges. It was very much an elite phenomenon. At the grassroots level, you would see all the communities coming together at the Autonomy Club, which was the anarchist club on Charlotte and Windmill Street, later during key events. So this would be one where everybody would get together and people would sing in different languages. You would see it also on the 18th of March for the anniversary of the Commune. You would see it on May Day as well. So real cross-community events. But there was a real international collaboration and a real international sentiment which was expressed. And I think that is quite new and that is quite specific to this period of exile. Now, chapter 4 examines the thorny terrorist question and tries to draw the line between the many myths surrounding the London groups and the actual extent of propaganda by the deed among them. So, as I've mentioned, the French police kept a really close eye over the exiles from the very moment they arrived in Britain. And I've listed, I think, 7 spies throughout about a decade. So that's quite significant, and countless informants. The French police tried to cooperate more or less successfully with the far more efficient special branch of the British Metropolitan Police, which is the forerunner of Scotland Yard. And the person in charge of looking after the anarchists for the British surveillance services was Inspector Melville, of French descent, nicknamed Vile Melville by the anarchists, and they absolutely loathed him. Diplomatic tensions arose over the use of foreign spies in Britain, especially over the use of French and Italian spies, because this was seen as an interference from foreign powers, suggesting all of this, that international cooperation was as much of an issue, a problematic one for French and British police as it was for the anarchists themselves. It's a time of fumbling internationalism in many areas. Now, clearly, the recurring depiction of London as, I quote a contemporary source, a most serious anarchist conspiracy was not a pure figment of collective imagination. The French groups found themselves at the center of 3 bomb scandals in the space of 5 years. First, Walsall, in 1892-93, a bomb plot originating in a Midlands anarchist club and involving 3 Frenchmen. So it resulted in arrest and long prison sentences for the comrades, but the plot was later shown to have been instigating by Scotland Yard. And especially, through the French agent provocateur Auguste Coulon, who was very, very well placed in anarchist circles. In 1893, the same Coulon was most likely the person who planted bomb in the anarchist school which Louise Michel had opened on Fitzroy Square, and this resulted in the school's closure. Thirdly, as I mentioned at the beginning, the explosion of a bomb in the Greenwich Observatory Park in 1894 was probably the most memorable anarchist-related terrorist scare of the period. So Martial Bourdin died when the bomb which he was carrying towards an unknown destination accidentally detonated. And you may have come across this because it provided the basis for Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent. So unsurprisingly, given all this, anarchists became a political and diplomatic football in contemporary debates on asylum, and despite their small numbers, they played a significant role in redefining Britain's immigration policy. The early 1890s witnessed the emergence of what was called at the time a restrictionist party, advocating a restriction on that open door policy in the field of immigration. And this, the arguments of this party, of this lobby, if you would like, was really based on fears of economic and racial decline. And this was linked really to the perceived uncontrolled immigration of radical foreigners. The terrorist scandals involving foreign anarchists, the anarchist peril in general, and mass immigration from Eastern Europe were all key arguments. There was also the fear of becoming the dumping ground of foreign powers, which was a recurring sort of diplomatic argument. In 1898, an anti-anarchist conference, international conference, was held in Rome, bringing international Western powers, and France and Britain both refused to enter the agreements signed following the conference. This is taken to be the starting point of what later became Interpol. So resulting from this effort to control anarchist networks. Now, it is quite unclear why France and Britain refused to enter these agreements. It's possibly to keep their surveillance practices secret. The agreements were strengthened in 1902 and 1904, but Britain again refused to enter any formal arrangement. The turning point came in 1905 with the passing of the Aliens Act, which had little impact initially, but it was reinforced in 1911 following yet another scandal involving foreign revolutionaries. This was the Sydney Street siege, a very spectacular robbery in the East End of London, which degenerated into a 24-hour siege, which involved the death of a policeman and that of an anarchist as well. And this really stigmatized all revolutionary groups for good. Incidentally, that Sydney Street siege was an important moment in the career of a young Home Secretary called Winston Churchill. So after 1914, the figure of the German spy became the new nemesis of the population. But in the meantime, this era of liberal tolerance and this tolerance towards foreign political refugees had come to an end. And the anarchists had been really instrumental in bringing this. Now, the Aliens Act did not quite put an end to transnational anarchist cooperation, because small but active political networks remained after those years in London, and they played a very important role in the dissemination of syndicalism from the mid-1890s onwards. They were also active in other fields, putting together protest campaigns against political repression in Spain, especially for the defense of Francisco Ferrer, who was a very notable figure at the time. Also, small networks involved in the setting up of communes and free schools, and there was quite a significant exchange of ideas in this period. But really, the post-1895 period saw a great deal of exchanges over the question of syndicalism, what gradually became syndicalism. So it really started in London when Puget, in the pages of Le Père Pénard, started extolling the example of British trade unionism, whilst acknowledging that they were not extremely revolutionary institution. He saw a potential for revolutionary action in the context of trade unions. He really liked the practice of what he later called sabotage, or calcani in English. And he suggested very, very unambiguously importing these to the French context and advocating that French anarchists enter trade unions. So this continued for quite a few years, and it traveled really back and forth. This 1896 Congress was a turning point where the anarchists were expelled from the Second International, and this reinforced their interest in trade unionism. And at around the same time, they got to meet Tom Mann, and this was a small but extremely productive connection, and they remained in contact. And I think Tom Mann was probably the main person, one of the main persons in Britain for importing the ideas of syndicalisme révolutionnaire from France. And the French throughout this period looked at what was being done across the channel and imported back some of these ideas. So you have a very interesting back and forth movement. And again, with the few exiles who remained in Britain at the time, you do see exchanges. And for instance, in 1895, another very short-lived paper was set up by French, British, and Spanish exiles called the General Strike, la Grève Générale, la Huelga Générale, sorry. And again, really dedicated to this international dissemination of syndicalism. Now, this pretty much sums up the contents of the book, and I'd just like to say very, very briefly a few words about follow-up projects. I have really one project which is which I would like to talk about here. It's called Transnationalizing French Anarchism Through Biography, and it's a brief research project funded by the British Academy. It's a study of 3 prominent anarchists of the pre-World War I period, 2 of whom lived well beyond the war years, and all of whom are usually regarded as symbols of a quintessentially French anarchism, when in fact they were very, very active international militants. So I think there was considerable scope for not completely rewriting the history of French anarchism, but really for emphasizing the international dimensions of this movement. So the 3 individuals in question are Louise Michel, 1830-1905, Charles Malato, whom I've mentioned before, 1857-1938, and Jean Grave, 1854-1939. So this is really a study on transnational activism and the role of political intermediaries. This is quite a productive field of research within the broad field of transnational studies, and there have been lots of terms to describe all these people, intermediaries between cultures. So some prefer to speak of cultural brokers, some speak of militant go-betweens. In French we speak of passeurs, passeuses. So this is what the study is about. So the first one is Louise Michel. I'll come back to this. So Louise Michel in London. So Michel, of course, is probably the most famous of all these anarchists. She's the icon of communard and anarchist militancy, famously a passionate internationalist, but whose practical militancy is not that well known. So Michel settled almost permanently in London in 1893 and lived there until her death in 1905 with some brief interruptions. So this was pretty much a deliberate choice on her part, really to avoid political surveillance in France. As a very active militant, she was under constant scrutiny. So in London, she used her immense rallying power and charisma to bring together the different socialist groups, coexisting in this great metropolis. And through Michel, political and national barriers were really transcended. And she was one of these people I mentioned before who could bring everyone together, bring all the militants from all the international groups present in London together. So she took also a few practical but also symbolical initiatives to express her internationalism while in London. So, as I mentioned before, she opened a school on Fitzroy Square next to the French anarchist quarter. And there she wanted, I quote, "By taking all these young French, English, German children, by teaching them languages, make them able to know themselves, to understand themselves later, so that gradually, through the communion of ideas, nations may be able to hate one another less at first, and then eventually to love one another." End of quotation. So her other internationalist endeavours included plans for a London-based asylum for political exiles, which I think, again, confirms this idea that exile was quite an important phenomenon at the time, really, and there was a perceived need for this asylum. And also, quite unusually, she decided to learn English while she was in London. We may take it for granted, but it was in fact highly unusual for all these exiles to decide to learn the language. So the fact that she decided to learn English was really applauded at the time as a sign of great internationalist commitment. And of course, she had very international sociabilities. She knew a lot of people. I have heard of an exchange of letters between Louise Michel and Queen Victoria. I am still to find traces of this, but she was undeniably extremely well connected across nationalities and across political groups. So her political views were characterized by mysticism, broad generalization, emotional emphasis, a sweeping love for mankind. As Georges Clemenceau wrote about her, brushing indifferently with the sublime and the ridiculous. There was also a great consistency to her vision, which is underpinned by this great universal vision of mankind and its destiny. So what I'm really interested in through Michel is really this incredible power she had as a political icon, whose political charisma derived really from her militant past, a great militant past as a communard, her universal vision, her emotional appeal, to the point really where what she actually did, her actual political thinking didn't really matter. So this is a type of political intermediary whose power came from emotions, her charisma really. Now a different type, or a different profile, Charles Malato, here sketched by his friend Kupka, the illustrator, chasing women, possibly in the street of London, and here a much sterner portrait taken by the police. So Malato, in some respect, is the antithesis. So he was a militant active in New Caledonia, France, Britain, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and this was just a few of the destinations he touched in his wide-ranging involvement. So as I mentioned, he chronicled the London years with his great book, Les Joyeusetés de l'Exil. He was an incredibly prolific writer and journalist, as well as an activist who organized revolutionary coups in a variety of countries, and he didn't quite try to hide it. From London, he hopped over to Brussels one day to try and initiate the revolution at a supposedly propitious time, but didn't quite happen. So what we see with Malato is the combination of intense writing and traveling in forming networks. Malato was multilingual. He spoke French, Italian, very good English, Spanish, and I think there is something to be studied there through multilingualism, which was quite unusual at the time, and how it may have spurred the creation of networks. And also, lastly, there is the fact that he was quite well known at the time in international revolutionary circles, internationally, not strictly anarchist circles. And he seems to be the classic instance of a lesser-known intermediary who must have been quite influential in his time and certainly brought many different groups together. But somehow, with time, the memory has faded, and he's somebody, I think, quite an interesting figure to resurrect. And I think it will show something about the political life and what activism meant in this period. Thirdly, Jean Grave and his paper, Les Temps Nouveaux, one of his extremely influential anarchist papers, Les Temps Nouveaux. So Grave was the editor of Les Temps Nouveaux, the main anarchist publication of pre-World War I anarchism. And Grave illustrates what may be called immobile transnationalism. I'll explain. So Grave was nicknamed Le Pape de la Rue Mouffetard by his good friend Malato. So you can see 140 Rue Mouffetard, that's where Grave lived and edited his paper throughout the pre-World War I period. He didn't go into exile, and he stayed there. He went to prison for a brief spell. But this is extremely surprising if we consider the fact that through his various publications, Grave was at the center of what was possibly one of the largest informal political networks of the time internationally, and certainly the biggest international anarchist network. So a random issue of any of Les Temps Nouveaux in a year of very low militancy, very low international activities would include translated articles from a publication from Kansas on the topic of Mexican revolutionaries, as well as correspondences from comrades based in Oakland, in Iowa, in San Francisco, Los Angeles. So this is really a random draw I've done. It's very US-centric for some reason, but really he covered the whole of the world in his paper. And Asia, for instance, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, very, very well documented. And he had a network of correspondents and translators, which was truly global. And his paper was similarly disseminated across the world. I have evidence of Les Temps Nouveaux being read in San Francisco, very, very influential in disseminating Kropotkin's ideas in Australia, in Asia again. So the idea of this man in his little attic room in the Rue Mouffetard having this significant influence really in disseminating these ideas, I think is really quite striking. And also, what's quite interesting is that the paper itself was produced really internationally in collaboration with Peter Kropotkin, who lived in the London area and the English South Coast for most of the period. So both men exchanged detailed letters discussing current affairs, common acquaintances in various countries, France, the state of the movement as a whole, and they really oversaw the edition of the joint papers together. So, and many articles were written by Kropotkin and then printed in Les Temps Nouveaux, and similarly many articles from Les Temps Nouveaux were reprinted in Kropotkin's paper Freedom, which was published in London. So you have very interesting to and fro movement. So for a popular movement which was really quite poor, I think there's a very interesting instance of binational split-side publication, which was quite unique and actually quite influential. So I think Grave's example raises question about the nature of transnational politics, and in particular this idea that you do not need to travel to have a global influence, even at the time, which I think is quite interesting. And finally, through Grave, who had a very, very long political career, we have it's a good example to study a political network of a really long period of time. But after 1917, really the ideological debacle of the First World War for the anarchists, Grave was very much an isolated man, really struggling financially and really desperately trying to recapture his personal and larger political network from the pre-war area. So it's very much a rise and fall story, and I do hate to finish on such a sad note, but this is actually what I will finish on.